the M4 Sherman tank became one of the most iconic symbols of American military power during World War II. It was the backbone of the American armored forces, rolling off assembly lines at an unprecedented pace. Between 1942 and 1945, a staggering 50,000 Shermans were produced, making it one of the most widely used tanks of the war. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago were cranking them out as fast as they could be assembled, reflecting the urgency of wartime production. On the surface, the Sherman appeared to be a perfect match for the Allied forces' needs. It was relatively easy to produce, versatile, and reliable in most combat situations. But beneath its sturdy exterior lay a vulnerability that would prove disastrous for countless soldiers on the battlefield. While the Sherman was hailed as a reliable workhorse, it wasn't impervious to the harsh realities of warfare. When the Shermans encountered the devastating power of German artillery, particularly the infamous 88mm gun, a deadly flaw became apparent. The tanks were designed with armor that, while seemingly sufficient on paper, was structurally compromised by a significant design flaw. This flaw lay in the way the armor plates were welded together. It wasn't immediately apparent, but it would prove to be a fatal weakness that led to many tank crews losing their lives in a horrific manner. Tank crews quickly discovered this flaw when they encountered German artillery in North Africa and Italy. The moment they faced a German 88mm round or other high-velocity projectiles, they realized that the Sherman tank's armor could fail in a particularly deadly way. It wasn't just that the armor was penetrated by enemy shells, though that was part of the problem. It was how the tank's armor plates were joined together. The joint between the steel plates, made with a butt weld, was where the true vulnerability lay. When a German shell struck the weld seam, something catastrophic happened. Instead of the tank's thick armor absorbing the impact, the weld would fail, causing the plates to separate. The result wasn't just a penetrating hit that could kill the crew. It was a chain reaction of fire and explosion inside the tank, which led to immediate death for most who were inside. The men who had to fight from inside these machines quickly developed a grim sense of humor to cope with the constant fear of death. The M4 Sherman earned the nickname Ronson, after the popular cigarette lighter brand whose slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." It was dark humor, certainly, but it reflected a sad reality. Once the tank caught fire, there was little chance of survival. The flames from the shell's explosion could quickly turn a steel box into an inferno, and the crew inside had only a matter of seconds to escape before the fire consumed them. The British, fighting alongside American forces in North Africa, also had their own term for the Sherman. They called it the Tommy Cooker, again reflecting the deadly nature of the tank once it was hit. The military, however, did not address the issue immediately. These nicknames were never mentioned in official reports or in military propaganda, but they were frequently found in the letters soldiers sent home. Men on the front lines, who had witnessed the deadly fires firsthand, used these names in an attempt to describe the terrifying vulnerability of the Sherman. The problem wasn't just with the thickness of the armor, as many reports suggested. It wasn't even just that the Sherman was outgunned by the Germans. The real issue lay in the welding technique used to join the armor plates. The United States Army had set up standardized welding specifications in 1941, which were meant to make production faster and more efficient. In a war where speed was essential, the Army developed a standardized butt weld for joining steel plates. The specifications required that the plates meet edge to edge, with molten metal filling the joint between them. On paper, this method was efficient and ideal for mass production. The focus was on getting tanks out as quickly as possible, with the assumption that steel was steel and the welding would hold. The Army's approach was focused on speed, not on ensuring the strength of the armor under battlefield conditions. However, this approach proved to be disastrously flawed when exposed to the realities of combat. German artillery, specifically the 88mm gun, was capable of firing rounds with incredible velocity and accuracy. These shells were designed to penetrate the toughest armor, and they were devastatingly effective against the Shermans. The shells would strike the tank's armor at high velocity, and instead of simply penetrating it, the welds, the joints where the armor plates were fused together, would fail under the stress. The failure of the weld created a gap in the tank's armor, which allowed superheated gas and molten metal to enter the tank. This turned what would have been a survivable hit into an inferno inside the vehicle, igniting ammunition, hydraulic fluid, and fuel tanks. The results were catastrophic. Tank crews had only about 90 seconds to escape the tank once a fire started, assuming the hatches weren't jammed and that they weren't injured by the initial blast. The problem wasn't just the risk of being hit in battle, it was the risk of being burned alive in a machine that was supposed to offer protection. The stories from the front lines were horrifying. Crews who survived the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 reported the same thing. Their tanks didn't just catch fire, they came apart at the seams. The vulnerability was clear. It wasn't just the thickness of the armor that was the problem, but how the armor was joined together. The weld seams were failing under impact stress, leading to a catastrophic loss of life. Tank commanders and crews requested better armor, more powerful weapons, and more effective protection. They received sandbags to add to the tanks and instructions to flank enemy positions more effectively. Yet, despite mounting evidence from the battlefield, nobody in the Army's procurement department considered the possibility that the welds themselves were the problem. Steel is steel, after all, and it was assumed that the issue was simply a matter of adding more armor. It wasn't until late 1943, after more than a year of heavy fighting, that the issue was finally addressed, but not in the way it should have been. The Army was so focused on meeting production quotas that the idea of improving the welds seemed almost impossible. The speed of production had been optimized for efficiency, and any modification to the tank's manufacturing process would slow things down. The military did not realize that this flaw in the design was leading to unnecessary deaths on the battlefield. But a solution was coming, one that would come from an unexpected source. Thomas Wilder, a welder working at Chrysler's tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, was the man who would provide the solution. Wilder wasn't a trained engineer, he was a craftsman with years of experience working with metal. He had spent over a decade welding ship hulls on Great Lakes freighters before the war. The type of welding he did required a level of craftsmanship that was precise, especially considering the harsh conditions the ships would face. When Wilder was reassigned to work on Sherman tanks in late 1943, he quickly noticed a flaw in the Army's welding specifications. He understood that the Army's standardized butt weld, while efficient, wasn't the best choice for a combat vehicle. Wilder realized that the butt weld was creating a stress concentrator, a weak point in the joint that would fail under the kinetic energy of a high-velocity impact. Wilder knew that the solution was simple, yet it went against Army protocol. Instead of the standard butt weld, he proposed using a double V groove weld, which involved welding from both sides of the steel plates and ensuring complete penetration of the weld. This technique was more time-consuming and would slow down production, but it would make the tank's joints far stronger and able to withstand the impacts of enemy fire. He was convinced that his method could solve the problem, but the risks of proposing such an idea were high. By January 1944, Wilder had gathered enough proof to show that his technique could work. He conducted his own field test. In the dead of night, without permission from his superiors, he welded a piece of tank armor using the double V method and arranged for it to be shot at with a captured German 88mm shell. The result was staggering. The armor didn't crack, the weld held. The seam remained intact, despite the high-velocity impact. Wilder knew this wasn't just a lucky test, he had created a solution that could save lives. But he also knew that going through the official channels to present his idea would be futile. The military bureaucracy, with its emphasis on production quotas and contractual obligations, would never approve a change that could slow things down. So, he turned to an unconventional route to get his idea into the field. In February 1944, Wilder made contact with Captain Robert Chen, a maintenance officer who had spent months with the 2nd Armored Division in Italy. Chen understood firsthand the importance of keeping tanks operational and was eager to listen to Wilder's ideas. The two men connected, and Chen agreed to take Wilder's technique back to Europe. Wilder had no official endorsement, but he was willing to break the rules if it meant saving lives. By the summer of 1944, Wilder's technique had already been tested in the field. Maintenance crews were modifying the tanks they repaired, applying the double V welds to Sherman tanks that had been damaged in combat. The results were undeniable. Tanks that had been repaired with Wilder's method were surviving hits that should have destroyed them. Tank crews were coming back from the front lines with their tanks intact, whereas other crews were losing tanks to weld failures. By September 1944, Wilder's technique was in widespread use in the European theatre. And although the Army never officially acknowledged the modification, it was making a real difference. The survival rate for tanks repaired with the new welding method was far higher than that of tanks with the standard welds. In the end, Thomas Wilder was never recognized for his ingenuity. He retired quietly from Chrysler in 1949, never receiving any accolades or official recognition. But his work had an impact that would last long beyond the war. In the years following World War II, the military would adopt new welding standards, which closely resembled Wilder's W method. The lessons learned from the Sherman tank's design flaw would become foundational in the construction of modern armored vehicles, including the M1 Abrams tank. Today, Wilder's approach to welding continues to influence the standards for tank construction worldwide. As the M4 Sherman tanks rolled across the battlefields of North Africa and Italy, the soldiers who fought from within them were starting to understand the grim reality they faced. The tank had become both a shield and a prison, offering some protection from the onslaught of German fire, but it also came with a dangerous flaw that was proving deadly. The men inside the tanks had become familiar with the unmistakable sound of an 88mm shell, screaming toward them the inevitable thud as it struck their hull. For those fortunate enough to survive the initial hit, the real nightmare was just beginning. Inside the tank, the blazing heat, the unbearable pressure of the blast, and the searing flames from a ruptured fuel tank or ignited ammunition made escape nearly impossible. The tragic irony was that these failures often weren't the result of superior enemy firepower, but rather the result of a design flaw in a machine that was supposed to protect the soldiers. While the world at large, and even many in the military, remained unaware of the true cause of these horrific tank fires, the men on the front lines, the tank crews, were acutely aware. They knew what was happening, and the whispers spread like wildfire. By early 1944, rumors and first-hand accounts of tank fires, brewing up from simple hits that should have been survivable, were everywhere. It wasn't just the war-weary soldiers who were talking. Commanders knew, too. In the midst of the chaos, the requests for upgrades became desperate. Tank commanders were asking for better armor, more powerful guns, and more protection for their crews. Yet, when they spoke to the Pentagon or their superiors, they were given little more than sandbags to increase the armor's thickness and directives to flank the enemy more carefully. But behind the scenes, a quiet rebellion was brewing, one that no one could have expected: a rebellion against the system. In a factory in Warren, Michigan, a 52-year-old welder named Thomas Wilder had started to question the very specifications that were driving the war effort. Wilder, a craftsman from the shipyards of Detroit, had been trained to weld ship hulls. His experience on the Great Lakes, where ships faced extreme conditions from ice storms to high waves, taught him a harsh truth about metal. It needed to be welded correctly, especially when the stresses it would face were unpredictable. Wilder wasn't an engineer or a high-ranking officer. He was a craftsman, and like many craftsmen, he had a deep respect for the materials he worked with. He understood the nature of metal, how it behaved under pressure, how it could be shaped to withstand tremendous force. It was this knowledge, honed over years of welding ship hulls, that made Wilder realize something no one else had. The Army's welding specifications, designed for speed and efficiency in production, were flawed. The butt weld, a simple edge-to-edge joint that filled the seam with molten metal, was quick to produce but didn't provide the strength necessary to withstand high-velocity impacts. Wilder recognized that this simple flaw in the design could cost men their lives. And so, while most of the military's focus was on improving the tank's guns and armor, Wilder had a different idea. He wanted to change the way the tanks were built from the inside out, starting with the welds. In December 1943, Wilder took matters into his own hands. The Army's military specifications were clear: butt welds were the standard, and that was the rule. But Wilder wasn't content with the standard. He didn't believe that simply meeting the Army's specifications was enough. He understood that to save lives, he needed to strengthen the seams, and so he began experimenting with a technique that went against everything the Army had outlined. Wilder's double V-groove weld method involved beveling the edges of the steel plates, welding both sides, and ensuring 100% penetration of the material. It would take longer, but it would create a stronger, more durable joint that could withstand the impact of an enemy shell. Wilder knew the risks. He knew that what he was proposing was considered a violation of the Army's guidelines, a potential breach of contract, and could cost him his job, or worse. Yet, he pressed on. Late one evening, after hours, he took a scrap piece of tank armor and applied his method. The next step was to put his theory to the test. But it wasn't going to be a simple experiment. Wilder needed to know if this method would hold under the pressures of actual combat conditions. That meant taking it to the firing range. In the early hours of January 1944, Wilder made his way to the test range, where he managed to secure the help of a fellow soldier, a sergeant who ran the tests. Despite the official rules, this sergeant understood the importance of testing new ideas. The army had been failing to deliver the results that the men in the field needed, and so he was willing to help Wilder with his secret test. They set up the scrap piece of armor at a realistic range and fired a captured German 88mm shell at it. This was it, the moment of truth. As the 88mm round struck the weld, Wilder held his breath, watching the test unfold before him. The result was nothing short of staggering. The weld held firm. The steel didn't crack or split as it had done so many times before. Instead, the armor deformed slightly, but the joint remained intact. The piece of armor did not split open, nor did it ignite. The result was exactly what Wilder had hoped for. The weld was stronger than the base metal itself. Under the intense pressure of the shell's impact, the armor held together. It didn't explode, and it didn't burn. Wilder was not only excited by the result, he was convicted that this method could save countless lives. He knew, however, that testing a scrap piece of armor was one thing, but getting his method into the field was something else entirely. It was one thing to prove it in a controlled setting, but it was another to get this technique adopted at a time when the Army's manufacturing process was focused solely on mass production. Wilder couldn't just go to the top. He knew that the bureaucracy would crush his idea before it ever saw the light of day. The chain of command was too rigid, the rules too inflexible. But Wilder was determined to push forward. In February 1944, Wilder found a way to get his findings to the front lines. A Captain Robert Chen, a maintenance officer who had been in Italy with the 2nd Armored Division, was about to return to the U.S. For a short time, Wilder knew that Chen would be the key to getting his idea out of the factory and into the hands of the men who truly needed it, the tank crews who fought on the front lines. Wilder approached Chen and shared his findings, explaining how his modified welding method could save lives. Chen was quick to grasp the importance of what Wilder was proposing. He had seen firsthand the devastating effects of poor armor joints, and he knew that this new technique could make a significant difference in the survival of tank crews. But Chen also understood the dangerous politics involved. Military regulations were clear. Any deviation from the Army's specifications was grounds for termination, or worse. Nonetheless, Chen agreed to take Wilder's method back to Europe with him. He took notes, photographs, and sketches, with the understanding that this wasn't an official procedure but a possible field modification. By the time June 1944 arrived, D-Day had come and gone. The tanks that landed on the beaches of Normandy were a far cry from the ideal machines the military had hoped for. They were still vulnerable to enemy fire, and the crews had little protection against the deadly flaw in the armor. Yet, in the midst of this, tank commanders and maintenance officers began to notice something strange. Tanks that had been repaired using Wilder's technique, those with the double V weld, were surviving. In some cases, they were taking multiple hits and still returning to the fight. This was unheard of. The word spread quickly. Crews began to realize that those tanks with the new welds weren't just lucky, they were built better. Tanks that should have been destroyed were coming back, and so the modifications began. In the field, Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski of the 4th Armored Division was one of the first to apply Wilder's technique to the tanks under his care. Kowalski was a welder by trade, and he had the expertise and equipment to modify the tanks. He began training his team in the new welding method, focusing on the beveling, penetration, and grinding techniques that made Wilder's method so effective. By July 1944, the modified tanks were already proving their worth. Lieutenant Colonel James Bates, a tank commander, began noticing a stark difference between the modified tanks and the standard production tanks. Out of 41 tanks under his command, 14 had been repaired using Wilder's method. By the end of the month, Bates had lost 19 tanks, but only 2 of those were the modified ones. The other 17 tanks had failed because of the standard welding techniques. This was a dramatic improvement in survival rate. Bates submitted his findings up the chain of command, reporting that tanks with Wilder's method had an 85% survival rate, compared to just a 58% survival rate for those with standard welds, but the official response from headquarters was cautious and non-committal. Nonetheless, tank commanders began quietly pushing for more modified tanks. The Army knew that something was changing in the field, but they were unwilling to acknowledge the role that field modifications were playing. In August 1944, an internal Army study began analyzing tank losses across multiple divisions. The results were undeniable. Tanks with modified welds had a 34% improvement in survivability when faced with German anti-tank guns. That translated to over 850 saved men who would have otherwise burned to death inside tanks with poorly constructed armor. The evidence was clear, but the Army continued to stay silent. By October 1944, the modified welds had become the standard in frontline maintenance units across the European theater. The Army never officially acknowledged the change, but the men who fought on the front lines knew the truth. They had been saved by a craftsman who had broken the rules to save their lives. As the war raged on, the situation on the front lines of Europe continued to grow more brutal. By the summer of 1944, the Allied forces were deep into their campaign following the invasion of Normandy, and the battle to liberate Europe from the Nazis was in full swing. The beaches of Normandy, now stained with blood and history, had set the stage for the brutal battles that would unfold. For the men of the 2nd Armored Division, the story was no different. The fight was relentless, and the battlefield was often unforgiving, filled with obstacles and dangers that were not always visible to the naked eye. Among the greatest threats they faced, however, wasn't just the ever-present danger of enemy fire, it was the very tanks they relied upon. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the American Army, had been essential in the battle, but the more it was used, the more its flaws became apparent. While the tank was seen as reliable, sturdy, and relatively easy to repair, there was one weakness that no one had truly accounted for: a design flaw that would prove to be deadly for the men inside it. The flaw wasn't the thickness of the armor, as had often been suggested by those unfamiliar with the technicalities. It wasn't the tank's armament, which many soldiers believed to be underpowered. No, the true problem was far more insidious. The Sherman's armor was welded together using a butt weld, which involved 2 plates of metal being joined at their edges with molten metal. This method was quick and efficient, perfect for mass production in the frenzy of wartime demands. But the flaw was in the design of this joint. Under the extreme pressure of enemy fire, especially from the German 88mm guns, these welds would often fail. The result? The plates would separate at the seam, leaving a gap through which superheated gas, molten metal, and fragments from the shell could pour into the interior of the tank. The tank would quickly become a fiery furnace, and the crew would have mere seconds to escape before the blaze consumed them. For those on the front lines, the situation was clear. The Sherman's design, while effective in many respects, had a fatal flaw. This wasn't just the story of a tank that could be destroyed. This was the story of a tank that, once struck, could incinerate its crew with terrifying efficiency. In North Africa and Italy, the men who manned these tanks were given grim nicknames for their machines: the Ronson, named after the cigarette lighter company, whose slogan promised "lights first time, every time." It was dark humor, certainly, but it was also a sad truth. The tank could ignite so easily that the men inside had little hope of survival once it caught fire. The British, who fought alongside the Americans in these campaigns, had their own term for the Sherman. They called it the Tommy Cooker again, a reference to the tank's tendency to burst into flames upon being hit. In the beginning, these names were never mentioned in official military reports. The military bureaucracy didn't want to draw attention to the deadly flaw that was being uncovered by soldiers on the battlefield. Instead, the focus remained on improving the tank's mobility and firepower, not its ability to survive a direct hit. The military was so caught up in the logistics of production schedules and the push to build more tanks that they failed to understand the true cause of the losses occurring on the front lines. Tank commanders who requested improvements to the Sherman's armor or weaponry were often given sandbags to place on the hull or flanking tactics as solutions, but never the answers they truly needed. No one in high command seemed to understand that the tanks were catching fire not because of a lack of armor, but because of a fundamental flaw in the welding technique used to join the plates of the tank's hull. By 1944, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Tank crews were losing their lives at an alarming rate, and the evidence that the welds were the root cause of these deaths was becoming harder to ignore. Men who had survived tank battles and returned home to tell their stories all spoke of the same thing: the tanks didn't just burn when they were hit, they came apart. When an 88mm shell struck a Sherman, the force was enough to cause the weld seams to crack open, leading to catastrophic damage. It wasn't just the armor being penetrated, it was the very integrity of the tank's design that was being compromised. The loss of these tanks wasn't a result of superior enemy firepower alone. It was a result of an issue that could have been fixed had the military been willing to take a deeper look at how these tanks were being made. The solution, however, was not coming from the top. The bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., was not interested in addressing the tank's welding problems. Thomas Wilder, a craftsman with years of experience as a welder in the shipyards of Detroit, knew that the only way to address the issue was to bypass the standard procedures and create a solution on his own. Wilder had been working at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, and as he examined the Army's welding specifications, he realized that the design flaw was simple. The Army's welding specifications were not designed to withstand the extreme conditions tanks faced in combat. The Army required a butt weld with 75% penetration, a method that was fast and efficient but ultimately too weak for high-velocity impacts. What Wilder proposed was simple double V groove welds. These would involve welding both sides of the steel plates and ensuring 100% penetration. This would eliminate the weak spot in the joint, making the tanks far more resistant to the kinds of impacts that had been proving so deadly. But Wilder's solution was not without its risks. The military specifications were clear. Any deviation from the established welding method would be considered a breach of contract. The risks for Wilder were enormous. He could lose his job, be discharged, or even face criminal charges if his unauthorized welding technique caused a tank failure. And yet, despite the risks, Wilder was convinced that his method could save lives. So, in the dead of night, without permission from his superiors, he began experimenting. He took a scrap piece of tank armor, welded it according to his method, and then took it to a test range where he arranged for a captured German 88mm shell to be fired at it. The results were nothing short of remarkable. When the 88mm round struck the piece of armor, the weld held. The armor did not crack open, nor did it catch fire. Instead, the shell gouged a small crater into the steel, but the weld remained intact. The result was proof that Wilder's technique worked. The double V weld was stronger than the original butt weld. Under extreme impact, the plates remained together, providing much-needed protection for the crew inside. Wilder had proven his point, but he knew the road ahead would be difficult. He couldn't take this breakthrough through the official military channels, as the consequences would likely result in it being shut down. Instead, Wilder needed someone who could take his findings directly to the front lines. That someone was Captain Robert Chen, a maintenance officer with the 2nd Armored Division. Chen had been on the front lines in Italy and understood firsthand the importance of keeping tanks operational. When Chen returned to the U.S. for a short period in early 1944, Wilder saw an opportunity. He approached Chen and shared his findings, explaining the benefits of his welding method. Chen, understanding the value of Wilder's discovery, agreed to take the information back to Europe. He carried Wilder's method with him, but this was no official military order. It was simply a recommendation from one soldier to another, a possible solution to a pressing problem. As the war continued in 1944, the success of Wilder's technique began to spread. Maintenance crews in Normandy and Italy began applying the double V weld to tanks that had been damaged in battle. Tanks that would have been destroyed with standard welds were now surviving hits that would have otherwise been catastrophic. The tanks came back from the front lines intact, and crews began to realize that the modified tanks were returning after multiple hits, their seams still holding strong. This new method was not just effective, it was a life-saving solution. Meanwhile, back in the U.S. military command, the situation was evolving. The growing success of the modified tanks could no longer be ignored. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, who had trained his men to apply Wilder's technique, began documenting the results. When tanks came back from the front lines, Kowalski would compare the modified tanks to those with the original welds. The results were undeniable. Tanks with the modified welds were surviving far longer, and the survival rate for the crew was significantly higher. Yet, when Kowalski was questioned by military inspectors in July 1944, he was forced to defend his actions. The official Army regulations had not authorized the use of Wilder's welding technique. Kowalski was at risk of being reprimanded or worse. But when pressed, Kowalski pointed to the tanks, the ones that had survived and returned to battle, and the ones that had been destroyed by faulty welds. The proof was in the field. Despite the military's resistance to officially approving Wilder's technique, it became clear that the modified welds were saving lives. The tanks that had been repaired with the WWII welds had a higher survival rate than those with standard welds. In the chaos of war, the men on the front lines had chosen what worked, not what was authorized. By August 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Bates had already seen enough to be convinced. Out of the 41 tanks under his command, 14 had been modified with Wilder's technique. The survival rate for these tanks was 85%, compared to just 58% for those with standard welds. It wasn't long before the Army Ordnance Department was forced to acknowledge the success of the modification. But even then, they couldn't admit the full truth. Instead, they quietly issued a revised standard, MIL STD 1261, in 1946, which mirrored Wilder's WWII welds without acknowledging his contribution. In the years that followed, the importance of proper welding in armored vehicle construction became ingrained in military doctrine. But the story of Thomas Wilder, the quiet craftsman who had saved so many lives, remained largely untold. His work wasn't celebrated with medals or public recognition. Instead, it became a footnote in the broader story of the war, but one that had a lasting impact on tank design and welding practices for decades to come. By the fall of 1944, the situation on the Western Front had intensified. The D-Day landings and subsequent battles through Normandy had opened the path for the Allies, but the German forces were fiercely resisting every step of the way. The 2nd Armoured Division was engaged in some of the toughest fighting, and the land was littered with the wreckage of tanks, vehicles, and artillery. The battle had not just been a war of attrition, it had become a test of survival for the men inside the tanks and for the technology that they relied on. For the men of the M4 Sherman tank crews, the war had become a paradox. The Sherman was their shield, their lifeline in combat, but it also had a fatal flaw that many had begun to realize could not be overlooked. The Sherman had proven to be reliable in many aspects, mobility, ease of use, and overall versatility, but the one glaring issue that continually haunted it was the welds holding the hull plates together. As the Allies made their way through France, Belgium, and into the heart of Germany, the Shermans were continually exposed to German 88mm guns and other artillery that would exploit this fatal flaw. The weakness was simple but devastating: butt welds. While seemingly efficient for mass production, these welds created a stress concentrator where the two plates of steel met. When a German shell hit this joint at the right angle, the welded seam would often fail. This wasn't just an issue of penetration, it was the resulting disintegration of the tank's integrity. Once the seam gave way, it allowed hot gases, metal fragments, and shrapnel to pour into the interior of the tank, starting a fire that would quickly consume both the vehicle and its crew. For many soldiers, it wasn't the artillery that killed them, it was the design flaw, the welding technique that hadn't been properly tested against the destructive force of modern anti-tank rounds. The nickname Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company, was coined by the tank crews to reflect the deadly nature of the Sherman when it was hit. "Lights first time, every time," was the slogan of the lighter company, but for the tank crews, it was a cruel joke about how the tanks would catch fire so easily. The British forces, fighting alongside the Americans, had their own grim term for the tank, the Tommy Cooker. The same humor, born of necessity, but a sharp reminder of how deadly the flaw in the Sherman's design truly was. These names never appeared in official army reports, but they were in countless letters home from the men who had fought, a way of coping with the reality that they might not survive the next hit. While these names circulated on the front lines, the military command in Washington, D.C. was still largely unaware of the full extent of the problem. The Army had made the Sherman its primary tank because of its production speed, its ease of repair, and its versatility. But senior leadership had never fully understood the destructive flaw that lay in the tank's welding. Tank commanders sent repeated requests for improvements to armor thickness, for stronger guns, and for better protection for the crews. What they were given were more sandbags to be placed on the hulls of the tanks, and instructions to rely on flanking maneuvers. Nothing was done about the root cause, the failure of the welds when exposed to high-velocity impacts. By early 1944, the evidence from the front lines could no longer be ignored. Tank crews knew that something was terribly wrong with the Sherman's construction. The reports from North Africa, Italy, and Normandy began to describe in detail how tanks were failing when hit in specific areas. Crews spoke of hearing a loud pop when their tanks were struck, and then feeling the tank disintegrate around them. Survivors spoke of how the tank would not only burn but also come apart at the seams, the hull splitting open. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't simply a matter of enemy superiority, it was an inherent flaw in the Sherman's welding. The tanks were being destroyed not because of better enemy guns, but because the very seams holding them together could not withstand the shock of high-velocity shells. In December 1943, at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, a 52-year-old welder named Thomas Wilder was assigned to work on the Sherman tanks. Wilder was not an engineer. He was a craftsman who had spent years working on the Great Lakes freighters, welding ship hulls, and learning how to make steel withstand the worst conditions. He had seen metal bend and flex under extreme pressure, and he knew what a good weld looked like. When he started working on the Sherman tanks, he immediately saw that the Army's welding specifications were not designed for the stresses that tanks would face on the battlefield. Wilder noticed that the Army's specifications called for a butt weld with 75% penetration, which was fine for ships navigating calm waters, but not for tanks that had to withstand direct hits from artillery. He realized that the root gap in the standard weld left a weak point that could easily fail under impact. Instead of the plates being completely fused, they were merely held together by the molten metal on the surface, which wasn't strong enough to withstand the impact of a high-velocity shell. Wilder's solution was simple double V-groove welds. This method involved welding the plates from both sides and ensuring 100% penetration through the entire thickness of the steel. The result would be a much stronger bond, one that could withstand the stresses of high-velocity impacts. Wilder knew that his technique was a risk. The Army had strict rules about welding standards. Any deviation from these standards could be seen as a breach of contract. However, Wilder also knew that men were dying because of this flaw, and he couldn't sit idly by while the Army continued to produce tanks that were inherently unsafe. So, in secret, Wilder began testing his new method. He took a scrap piece of tank armor and welded it using the double V method. Then, late one night, he convinced a sergeant who worked at the test range to help him test it. They fired a captured 88mm shell at the welded armor, and the result was exactly what Wilder had hoped for. The shell struck the weld, and the armor held. It didn't crack. It didn't explode. The welds held fast, and the tank's integrity remained intact. Wilder had done what no one else had dared to do. He had found a way to fix the Sherman's deadly flaw. But now he faced a new challenge: how to get this knowledge to the men who needed it most, the tank crews on the front lines. Wilder turned to Captain Robert Chen, a maintenance officer who had been on the front lines in Italy with the 2nd Armored Division. Chen was a soldier who understood the importance of keeping tanks operational, and he knew that any new method that could save lives was worth exploring. In early 1944, Wilder shared his findings with Chen, and the two men agreed that the double V weld method could be the key to improving tank survivability. But it was a dangerous idea. Military regulations were clear, and deviating from the specifications was forbidden. Chen knew that military bureaucracy would never approve such a change, but he was willing to take the risk if it meant saving lives. In the following months, Chen took Wilder's technique back to Europe with him, carrying the information in secret. It was a quiet rebellion, a workaround that the Army's high command couldn't approve through official channels. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, tanks with the modified welds began appearing in the 2nd Armored Division and other units. These tanks were surviving, and crews were beginning to notice the difference. Tanks that had taken multiple hits from enemy fire were returning to the battlefield. Tanks welded according to the Army's standard specifications were burning up on the spot, while those with the new double V welds were holding up against the same enemy artillery. By July 1944, enough evidence had accumulated that the Army could no longer ignore the results. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski of the 4th Armored Division had been repairing tanks in the field using the new technique, and the results were undeniable. Tanks that should have been destroyed were returning from combat. Kowalski, a veteran welder who had worked on skyscrapers in New York, knew the importance of a good weld. He had trained his men to apply the WWII method, and he was now seeing the results. Tanks that had been hit multiple times were surviving, and the crews inside were returning safely. Kowalski kept track of the success rate, documenting the survival rates for modified versus unmodified tanks. By August 1944, the Army had begun to quietly acknowledge the success of the modified welds. Lieutenant Colonel James Bates had tracked the losses in his battalion and noted that tanks with the new welds had a significantly higher survival rate. Out of 41 tanks, only 2 modified tanks were lost, compared to 17 unmodified tanks. Bates submitted his findings to his superiors, and the results were clear. However, the military was still hesitant to make an official change. The military bureaucracy didn't want to admit that their own specifications had failed. Wilder's contribution remained unacknowledged. The Army Ordnance Department finally made a move in 1946 when it issued new welding standards in MIL STD 1261, incorporating 100% penetration welding similar to Wilder's technique, but there was no mention of Wilder's role in the improvement. The change came too late for many men who had already given their lives, but it became foundational to tank construction for years to come. In the end, Thomas Wilder never received the accolades he deserved. He retired quietly in 1949 from Chrysler, his work largely unrecognized by the Army. But for the men who fought in Europe, Wilder's legacy was undeniable. His work had saved their lives, and in the hearts of those who returned home, that was all that mattered.